Hello everyone. Today I will present about our new study, which is entitled A Meta-analytic Review of the Effects of Multimodal Language on DLD Children's Language Development, which is part of a bigger meta-analytic project involving ASD and DLD populations. This work is being done by Prieto, Alfonso Igualada, and myself. First, as an introduction, we need to know what multimodality is. So multimodality is how us humans naturally communicate, making use of our body, our face, our hands, and our voice. And particularly, multimodality is known for gestures. And so these gestures are relevant for having various functions in communications, such as visualizing the content in speech or structuring the discourse. And importantly, what is the role of multimodality in development? So recent research has documented that multimodal language has a key role in typically developing children's development, such that it can benefit language development in terms of information and vocabulary recall, word learning and understanding, the comprehension of complex syntax, and more complex linguistic abilities, such as narrative and pragmatic abilities. Also, multimodal language can impact on cognitive development as it helps event recall, arithmetic understanding, and abstract mathematical learning and problem solving. And all in all, this evidence suggests that multimodal language promotes learning in development. And what about children with DLD? So we know that DLD children show difficulties in language development, but which role does multimodal language have on these difficulties? So some researchers have suggested that gestures in DLD populations have a compensatory effect for language difficulties, and others have suggested that gestures have a helping role in that it can help word learning and can predict later linguistic abilities. However, there are still some conflicting results on this topic, such that it is yet not clear whether DLD children gesture more than typically developing children or less. And so this is directly related to the fact that a scarce use of gestures is used as a criterion in diagnosing DLD. And also, recent research has indicated that it is not gesture rate, so the number of gestures produced, that it is related to language difficulties, but how accurate these gestures are. And so this conflicting evidence leads to our aims. So these are to assess typically developing children and DLD children's multimodal development and how it relates to their language development. So that is, which effects does multimodal language have on language development. And second, we would like to compare these effects reported by previous research. And for this, we ask what is the relationship between multimodality and linguistic abilities in DLD children reported in previous studies. And so to answer our research question, we looked at 4 different subgroups and analyzed their results and how they measured the data. So first, we will analyze descriptive studies that assess children's multimodal development, and then studies that assess the effects on language development. So either correlational effects, predictive effects, or processing and causal effects. And so to answer our research question, we used the guidelines by the PRISMA Statement for systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which has 4 different steps. And the first step refers to the identification of studies. And for this, we did a Boolean search in 7 different databases. And since this is part of a bigger project, as I said before, our search included autistic populations. So we searched for papers including either ASD or DLD populations with terms referring to multimodal language. Then the next step was to screen the abstracts of the papers that had come out from the search. And in this screening phase, we had to apply our inclusion criteria, And so those studies that did not follow the criteria were excluded. The next step was to review the full paper of the papers that had passed the inclusion criteria and to separate them in the 4 groups that I mentioned before. And so I will now summarize our search a little bit. So we first identified more than 1,100 papers, 1,500 papers, sorry, which ended in more than 700 papers after the duplicates were removed. And from these 700 papers, we removed more than 500 papers for not meeting the inclusion criteria. And so remember that these refer to the bigger search, including autistic children. So for this presentation, we narrowed down our search to DLD children, and we got 30 papers that were selected for full text review. And from these, 3 of them had to be excluded, for not being written in English or for not using quantitative measures. And the final 27 papers were analyzed qualitatively, and our quantitative analysis is still in development. So moving on to the results. From the 27 papers included, 20 of them were on DLD children and typically developing children. 3 of them were only on DLD children. 1 of them was on ASD and DLD children, and 3 were on ASD, DLD, and typically developing children. And so 22 of them reported the descriptive results on multimodal development. 7 reported correlational effects of gesture and language development. 1 reported predictive effects of gesture, and 5 reported the processing and causal effects of gesture. And so we will now review these results following these 4 groups. So as a general summary, we see that the average number of participants was around 36 participants, and that the mean age of the participants was between 5 and 6. And so multimodality was assessed differently. So gesture rate, the number of gestures produced, how accurate gestures were produced, the integration between gesture and speech, and how good children are at comprehending gestures. And then language measures included novel word learning, word frequency, grammar skills, sentence repetition, pragmatic comprehension, and the adequacy of responses in conversation. Then, if we move to the descriptive studies reporting on children's multimodal development, we observed that most studies found that DLD children gesture more than typically developing children, and then DLD children tend to produce more gesture-speech combinations than typically developing children. Also, concerning gesture accuracy, we found that there were conflicting results, as 2 studies report that typically developing children are more accurate in performing gestures than DLD children, and 2 studies found the opposite. So we will discuss these results later on. And finally, we found that DLD children seem to have more difficulties in comprehending gestures than typically developing peers. Then, if we move to the studies reporting the effects of gesture on language development, we observe that most correlational studies show that there is a positive correlation between gestural abilities and language measures, generally in both typical populations and DLD populations. Then we only found 1 study reporting predictive effects of gesture. And this longitudinal study found that iconic gestures produced by 12-month-old infants predicted sentence comprehension, sentence repetition, word production, and grammar production at the age of 5, and sentence repetition, word production, and grammar production at the age of 6. And finally, we found 2 studies that reported processing effects. And these studies showed that when instructions to certain tasks were provided with gestures, children performed better and got better marks than when they were given instructions without gestures. And so this is related to training studies that had a pre-test and post-test designs, which suggested a similar pattern. So children who were taught with gestures learn new words better than those trained without gesture. And so even though these results are typically both on typically developing children and DLD children, reinforce the idea of the helping function of gesture. Now we will move to the discussion and conclusions. So summarizing a little bit the results, we have seen in the descriptive studies reporting on multimodal development that DLD children tend to gesture more than typically developing peers, and that they have difficulties comprehending gestures. We found conflicting evidence on gesture accuracy, given that it seems that DLD children tend to produce less accurate gestures than typically developing peers, or the opposite. So we believe that the studies that found that DLD children were more accurate than typically developing children involved easier tasks, such as imitation tasks rather than elicitation tasks, so that imitation tasks are easier to perform than elicitation tasks. So we believe that DLD children present multimodal difficulties. And concerning the studies reporting on the effects of multimodality on language development, we observed that gestural abilities were positively correlated with linguistic abilities. And however, we observed that one study found that they were negatively correlated. And we believe that this conflicting result might be caused by a task difference, as this study to measure language used a specific language test rather than a more behavioral or experimental language test. We also found that pointing gestures at the first year of life predicted structured language at the ages of 5 to 6. And interestingly, we found a study that assessed these gesture speech predictions the other way around, showing that word frequency could predict gesture speech integration. And we finally found that giving instruction with gestures makes children perform better at language tests and pragmatic comprehension tasks, and also experimental trainings showed that children who were trained with gestures were better at learning new words than those trained without gesture. So all in all, our findings showed that DLD children have multimodal difficulties in terms that they gesture more than typically developing peers, which contrasts with diagnostic measures indicating that DLD children tend to produce fewer gestures. And so we see that DLD children produce more gestures. So these diagnostic measures should be revised. And also we observed that these children had difficulties in gesture comprehension. We also found that multimodal language and linguistic abilities are directly related in both typical populations and DLD children, and so that they are positively correlated, and gesture can predict language development. And finally, we observed that using gesture in training studies causes novel word learning. However, we believe that more evidence to support these ideas is still needed. And this is because there are some methodological problems in reported studies, and these have prevented conducting meta-analyses. So first, sample sizes tend to be very small, and so this prevents studies from reporting effect sizes. And also this is directly related to the fact that some studies needed to analyze DLD children and typically developing children all together to report the results. So for these, we think that larger sample sizes would help report effect sizes and to see the real comparison between typically developing peers and DLD groups. Also, we observed that there were differences in how DLD children were diagnosed and characterized. And therefore, we believe that we need more standardized measures and also to review that DLD children produce more gestures rather than fewer gestures. Also, we need more thorough definitions of multimodality. Since, for instance, we observe that one specific term can refer to many different aspects, such as gesture-speech integration, which can either refer to whether gesture replaces a word in speech or whether it temporally overlaps with a certain word. And then this is also related to the variability in tasks to measure specific gestural abilities. So we need more adequate and standardized tasks to measure multimodal abilities. And so all in all, we think that more refined methodological measures are needed to conduct meta-analytic review on this topic. And that's everything from us. Thank you very much. And we are really looking forward to your questions and comments. And in case you are interested, here you have the references that we used for this presentation and the tables that we used for our analysis. Thank you.